So one of the things that Phelan was going to address, because we've heard it again and again, is that, well, again, what good is open space? We're not getting any tax money from it. How is it helping I'm assuming most of you are property owners, property values? Well, take a listen to our realtor. 6 minutes, guys. Then we're going to have it.
Hi, everybody. I'll be brief. I think I heard 6 minutes, but I'll try to do this in 3. There are a lot of complicated issues here. Some of them I'm not qualified to talk about. The desperate need for housing is one of them, and I suspect that Tom may talk about that. Some of the environmental benefits surrounding open space, again, that's not really my primary focus. I just want to talk strictly in financial terms about the costs and benefits of preserving property. So in my view, and it sounds like there may be some disagreement here, preserving open space has been the best financial deal that the taxpayers have had. And Bob concluded by saying that whilst preserving some of these small parcels may not be as interesting, but they're important as well, in my view, preserving small parcels going forward would be the best thing that the town could do with the Community Preservation Fund. So here's the simple calculus for the gentleman out in the audience who's questioning this whole thing. First of all, whenever anybody comes out here for the first time, immediately their reaction is, wow, it's beautiful out here. Look at all this, it's great. And the natural beauty that surrounds all of us enhances all of our property values. So right away, all of the open space, even if it's not necessarily near your house out here, it makes your house more valuable because your house is in a beautiful community. When your house is more valuable, and it becomes worth more, it's taxed at a higher rate, and the town makes more money from the taxes. More directly, if your house is near any sort of preserved property, your house again is worth more because it's near that privacy. The first thing you'll see in real estate ads all over the place when it applies is near preserved property, next to a field that's been preserved, abuts a scenic easement on another property. Any sort of preserved property surrounding a house is highlighted in these real estate ads because it attracts buyers and it raises the value of those homes. Okay? So when we talk about the cost of build-out and whether or not it increases tax revenue to the town or decreases tax revenue, I think we have to make a division between second homeowners and local people, and we can sort of use, for shorthand, north of the highway and south of the highway. So most people living south of the highway in East Hampton, they do not have children in the schools. They are subsidizing all of us by building big homes that are taxed at high rates, and they're not putting their kids in schools. But as soon as you have somebody like me who pays $8,000 a year in property taxes and has 2 children, it costs maybe $50,000 a year for the schools to educate somebody like me, and there are lots of people like me. We cost the town a lot of money, and over the 12 years that my kids will be in school here, I will pay much less taxes than my kids use in terms of going to school. So, in north of the highway, in neighborhoods that are dominated by local people, preserving open space is a very good buy for the town, in my view. The town could buy more open space south of the highway. It's very expensive, and that's great. And fortunately, though, sometimes what happens south of the highway is neighbors will get together, and they will pool their resources, sometimes with private groups, sometimes with the help of the town, and they'll preserve parcels that adjoin their homes to preserve the beauty around them. But it never happens north of the highway. There are lots of little properties, and the neighbors can't get together to pay for them. So, and those are the properties that, when they're developed, end up being local people, oftentimes with children. And once those children are in school, then those people are paying much less taxes than the kids draw in the school system. So, in my view, if I was in charge of the CPF fund right now, and I'm glad to hear that there's $20 million in it, I think it's a great time for the town to buy small lots north of the highway, maybe in Springs, maybe in Northwest. Those property values have gone down a lot. Somebody mentioned 30 or 40% here today. I think that's about right. Very few small lots north of the highway are selling these days because there's no market for spec building north of the highway yet. A half acre north of the highway in Springs might be worth $200,000 these days, $225,000, and the town could buy an awful lot of them. And it would reduce density, and it would take houses off the rolls, many of which would have kids in them that would be expensive to go through the system. So that would be my focus. I think it's a great idea. There are other environmental benefits, I'm sure. But of course, it's in direct conflict with something that Tom's likely to talk about, which is there are a lot of local people who want houses, and maybe they would want to build them on these small lots north of the highway, which is where they might be able to afford to do it. The last thing I'm just going to say, just relative to Springs and Northwest and the density there is, again, when people come in to buy houses out here, and you talk about these areas, they're extremely concerned about buying in Springs, in particular because of the taxes. And as taxes go up in Springs, because there are more and more local people there with kids, the current owners in Springs are really getting hit in two directions. First, they're paying more taxes, and second, the perception that it's an expensive area because of the taxes is reducing their property values. So people in Springs are really, really getting squeezed. And I really do believe that that is the area that should be targeted most for density reduction, if possible. Okay?
It's a real perfect storm out there.
Yeah.
Jeremy, I hope you'll be also addressing a recent study that would talk to the concerns of, wait a second, maybe we should be developing our second home industry in certain sensitive areas because they help lower the tax rate.
Hi, thanks for coming out. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah. Okay, great. I'll start by asking a question. What's the state of our environment right now?
I didn't get many answers either, don't you?
Are we in balance? Are we in equilibrium? Is the water quality improving, stabilizing, or degrading at this point? Those are really the only three options that are out there. National studies by EPA of water quality across the United States are unambiguous in the determination that water quality, our drinking water quality, is declining. Studies on Long Island, most recently by Suffolk County Water Authority, duplicate, unfortunately, these results. The primary resource that we rely upon that comes from underneath our feet, as has already been said, is degrading. And what's true for our drinking water, by virtue of the fact of how these natural systems work, is also true for our surface waters. It's true for our air quality. You could argue it's true for our quality of life. And certainly there are economic and there are tax implications for this conversation. Study after study reaffirms that open space costs less and provides greater tax benefits than development. That's what we've heard. And there's an argument that's emerged. It's already come out here today. What's the role of second homes in this argument? Is there a substantial and distinct difference for the impacts associated with second homes than those that come with other types of development? I think if we're going to go down that road, we have to start by asking ourselves, what is a second home? What constitutes a second home? And I think folks who've lived here a while, I wasn't born and raised here, but I've lived here long enough, I think, to observe that there is a difference, that what constituted a second home 10 or 20 or 50 years ago is very different than what we can expect from a new second home that's built today, or how a second home is occupied today. We know this from our own experience just being residents of the town. I know Rudersham parking lots in the village, but I'll give you an example from there. This past weekend, President's Day weekend, was a holiday, and I went into the village and I wanted to spend my money and do my business, and I couldn't find a parking spot. And on the one hand, this is excellent. It represents business going on in the village. This is commerce. This is how we keep the wheels on the wagon. But what we also know from our experience of how second homeowners behavior has changed over time is that there's nothing that prohibits a second home or keeps a second home as only a second home in perpetuity. People retire into these homes. The services that they require as they retire into these homes are no different, and they are not distinct from the services that year-round residents require when they live here. So the off-season, the very definition of the season, has changed dramatically, even in the short number of years that I've lived here. It used to be that, we would joke about rolling up the sidewalks the day after the season ended and you could finally go down to the beach. We all know now that due to a whole host of reasons, there is both commerce, but there are impacts that roll out throughout the year. And so I think if we're going to engage in an argument that hinges on the idea that somehow there is a quantifiable difference or a distinction that separates one class of impacts from another, we simultaneously have to be intellectually honest about how those second homes are being used and whether or not we can anticipate in perpetuity that those second homes will forever and always be second homes. The question is, how many more second houses are built on undeveloped land before we need a second story on the Rudersham lot, to go back to my example? How many more second houses get built before we need a third full-time bus service that goes back and forth between the East End and New York City? Before we need additional stoplights, before we need additional traffic police? How many more second homes? We know that we're moving in the wrong direction in terms of stabilizing our vital resources, by which I mean environmental resources. I'll go back to our drinking water again as an example. The question then becomes, are we going to change course where there are still cost-saving opportunities, or are we going to wait until we reach full build-out on what remains and then try to figure out how to shift our economic, tax, and environmental resource management models? Essentially, do we wait until we don't have any other options and then change course? Or do we, at this point, while there remain options, choose to change course now? As my boss, Bob DeLuca, is fond of saying, if we continue in the direction we are headed, we're likely to end up exactly where we're going. Year over year, the cost of services are rising. We must choose between either cutting services or raising taxes. This is the reality with which we are all living in East Hampton town and, quite frankly, nationally at this very moment. Against this backdrop, we know our environmental resources are in decline. If we continue in this direction, we will not improve our prospects for an affordable or sustainable community. In closing, I'll give you one example. MS4 is a federally mandated program that decides how we must handle our stormwater. One of the greatest impacts to one of our most critical resources is the water that washes off of our lands and enters our water bodies. It affects our food supply, it affects our quality of life, it affects our drinking water. So there are federally mandated standards that we have to enact on the local level. Federal stormwater management regulations that East Hampton Town is already struggling to comply with are in place. We don't have the money to pay for the mandate that we've been handed. And that mandate is simply to meet a minimum standard to assure that we'll be able to drink our water without it poisoning us. So why, if in a community with so many existing second homes, where we're already unable to meet federal guidelines, would we remove the remaining natural systems that regulate stormwater and replace those natural systems with paved surfaces and hard structures that will require corresponding infrastructure to be built and maintained by workers that we haven't hired yet? Why would we continue in the same direction that we're going when we know that the destination is not someplace we want to be? This is all before we even get to the conversation about impacts to taxes from school districts and the like. Before we get to the point in the conversation where we're even talking about year-round versus second homes, we have to acknowledge that long-term, if we get to build out, if we don't preserve, we are taking one system that is functioning and costing us almost nothing and replacing it with another system that has to be built, engineered, managed, and maintained. And that costs money. And that's before we even get to the tax questions about school districts. So from an environmental question, to try to bring it full circle, What is the state of our environment? Are we in balance or equilibrium? Are we improving? Are we stabilized, or are we degrading? We're in decline. Each of our resources is in decline. And while there are glimmers of hope out there about specific places and ideas that are working, our resources are in decline. And the systems that we rely upon are in place but need our help. Are we now going to sell those systems only to have to replace them out of our own pockets with something that costs far more and doesn't generate the revenue required to maintain itself? Thank you.
Thank you. Just briefly, we've been talking about build-out. Build-out means the saturation population of East Hampton, including second homeowners. And there was a study done in February 2003 by the Suffolk County Planning Department, and they said under the zoning in 2004, before the most recent comp plan, there were enough vacant lots where East Hampton's population, including our second homeowners, is, drum roll, 89,566 packed into those 15 miles with the fragile resources that we've talked about. So it might sound like we're being one-sided in that open space is the best buy, preservation, but what about people preservation, which is going to come next? But just remember what that total mass could be. After we adopted the 2005 plan, the total population would be 86,662, give or take a few. That's a significant population to support a sole source aquifer, very narrow sandy spit of land, a beautiful sense of place. So we are talking about a balance that is a tightrope, because there's no redos, nowhere else to go. Now, with all this, how do we keep local people here? I mean, we've said your property values are going up. Actually, we're the second lowest tax town in Suffolk County. And that's probably because of our open space and our second homeowners. Shelter Island is the lowest. But meanwhile, how would you like to be getting out of school, even high school, and say, oh wow, you know, I need $60,000 down to buy a house on half an acre in Springs, which is a former student of mine. Luckily, they had parents here.